Hello and welcome to our presentation on culturally safe mental health care in urban Indigenous communities by the group Evergreen. So we're focusing on mental health care in Indigenous communities, specifically urban communities, and making a safe space for these Indigenous communities in urban areas to be able to focus on their personal sense of being and self. And the goals of this are creating safe spaces that not only acknowledge historical trauma that Indigenous people have suffered and colonial impacts as well. So things like stereotyping Indigenous peoples and history with erasing culture and specific health challenges that Indigenous people face, things like addiction and diabetes, which are in higher rates for Indigenous communities compared to Western areas. And that's the focus of that. So moving on to do this on the applications of this, their method using two-eyed seeing. For the Indigenous part, they focus for making safe space, they focused on using storytelling, symbol-based reflection. So that means, as you can see here with these three examples here, they have three men here as well. They were asked to pick a symbolic object to represent their lives and tell us stories and the relationship with community based on these three objects. As you can see, the first one here is a tobacco pouch. And this was a relation, this man who chose this was in relation to how this vote related to his group trust and life in the urban community and how it represented his Aboriginal background. And the same thing for the drum as well. Specifically for him, this drum was his way of connecting the youth to the Aboriginal community as he uses it in drum representations in urban Canada. So that would be the GTA and Toronto. And the buffalo calf woman was a painting chosen by one man specifically to represent his connection with his history and respect for the women in his community. As you can see there. And moving on to the science knowledge part, or supposed science knowledge part. And when we think of science knowledge, we think of observations, hypotheses, and experimentation. So thinking of observations, maybe doing experimentations to find conclusions. However, in this application of two-eyed seeing, there isn't actually any science at all. There's no, sorry, people giving notifications. There's no use of observations, hypotheses, or experimentation. Instead, there's a use of Western knowledge. And if I think I have a slide here from this article specifically, it's focusing on Western ways of knowing. So there is no hypotheses. Instead, it's on the way Western politics, hierarchies, and cultural life is with Indigenous ways of knowing. As you can see here, scientific method is a part of that, but it's not what this whole two-eyed seeing application was focusing on for the Western part. Instead, it was focusing more on combining the Indigenous ways of holistic and interconnected relationships with the world with the Western ways of individualization and mixed cultures and political systems in the Western way of knowing, specifically how that affects the urban areas in Western communities. For example, in Toronto, which is obviously much more urban than places further out in Canada. Goodness. And this Western eye was focusing on how the urban areas, Toronto, influenced the Aboriginal people to see beyond this. So it pushed for a change in community because not only were there people of Aboriginal and Indigenous backgrounds, there were people of many other backgrounds, including immigrants maybe from Asia, so-called Canadians, who work like Canadian government workers, and specifically those in healthcare, the nurse practitioners or healthcare workers focusing on mental health. And this sense of community was to focus on, to see help Indigenous people see that there is validity in their Indigenous background and original background, and to reach out past that, because they're no longer in a place with that as the Indigenous communities as the forefront. They're in a place where it's kind of not the whole, but a part of the whole, which pushed them to seek out more influence from their backgrounds. Which is on to conclusion and successes of this application. So first of all, a lot of these Indigenous men were able to create a positive identity with their Indigenous background because of the aforementioned Western and influence, because it pushed them to have more positive role models and positivity in life, to see their Indigenous background as something that should be important to them and that they can evolve in their everyday life and actively seek out. And as well as that, it also, actively seeking out Indigenous communities and engaging with them to really push their culture and history and see past what all the trauma and things there was about them, and focus on what and focus on the good in their lives and the good that they can bring to each other. However, this does have some challenges, specifically with stereotyping, as this kind of Aboriginal stereotyping, relies is really on a small demographic of people, and specifically this application was for Aboriginal men. So it doesn't include in Toronto. So it doesn't include anywhere maybe in British Columbia, Manitoba, or Nova Scotia, any of those who might have a different culture than the aforementioned people were above. And so we kind of just coupled this one study into a whole thing when there's a bunch of other people where this can be applied to. And a couple other challenges would be the relationships, identity, and community for everyone. So applying this to, aforementioned, all the other people in the world, because this relationship specifically focused on urban life in Toronto and Aboriginal men. So that doesn't include anyone else in their communities, or communities where they're not in urban areas, or communities where the relationship doesn't have that many positive role models, or they're having a hard time identifying positivity in their lives. However, this study did identify a lot of places for improvement in making these mental spaces safer and a lot more welcoming to Indigenous people. For example, they push for creating personal narratives for those practicing making these safe spaces. So teaching nurses and health practitioners to make their own narratives, to understand how this can apply to them, and how Indigenous people use narratives in their lives, and educate. And as well as that, they identify the need to educate these healthcare workers on Indigenous communities and how their relationships work with other people. And along with that, there's the idea of decolonization and reducing stereotypes of Indigenous people beyond Indigenous stereotypes. So for example, thinking that for healthcare workers that think Indigenous people are old-fashioned or maybe behind in their ways, and telling these nurse practitioners and healthcare workers that I'm getting notifications, sorry, that these Indigenous people aren't just that. They're actual people with actual issues, and they deserve to be heard and listened to. Yeah. And any questions? Sorry, I can't see the meat. I'm going to have to.
Yeah. Paul, your thoughts on this presentation?
Yeah, very good presentation. And you know that they have like 70,000 Nishnabs in Toronto from all over Canada. It's probably, if you include it, that would be the biggest reserve in Canada, not the most. So I put that out there. I guess people never really think about what causes these health problems as well. And in terms of racism, and we've only made leaps and bounds because of different court cases that we've had to take Canada to task on these issues to get any movement. So I would put that out there. That should be part of somebody's observation. And we agreed to share the land. And when people see somebody that's maybe downtrodden and of Aboriginal descent, is that before the colonizers got here, we all had a role to play in our society, and we all had jobs, and we all were able to feed ourselves. I just put that all out there to say that we didn't ask to be in this particular spot. We're trying to make the best out of what is there, but we have to heal from all the trauma that these students are talking about. Thank you.
Well said.
Very good presentation.
Anything to add, Steve?
No, I think in the interest of time, I think Paul's comments were probably much more insightful than I would have had anything, mostly because in this case it was pretty clear once again that even though it's two-eyed seeing, the focus in the article was not really on science, not on at least what we've been talking about, hypothesis-driven science.
Yeah, and that was